think we see the slides. That's good now.
Yeah.
It's good. Okay, excellent. Thank you. And I'm going to have to minimize because otherwise I don't see my slides. So yeah, hi, thank you. I'm really grateful to be able to participate in this workshop and talk a little bit about the FAIR data principles. I really think that this initiative for standardizing Tephra data to enable better use of Tephra data and advance the sciences is exemplary in our world of data management. And you hopefully get a feeling from my slides and how relevant it is to develop these community standards. As Steve mentioned earlier, I'm the director of EarthChem and the System for Earth Sample Registration, and as such have worked with the group that runs this initiative. And I'm really glad to see how much interest there is just by the participation in this workshop. When Christy just talked, well, it doesn't advance.
Let me explain this diagram. I think that.
Oops. Sorry, there was a problem here. It was the wrong slide. I apologize for that. It was funny that Christy mentioned this quote from George Strawn, because I've really admired his work in envisioning the advancement of research data management. And he really emphasizes the relevance of something like the FAIR principles or principles in general to guide the development and evolution of research data infrastructure at a fairly high level. So the goals of this Tephra initiative have really focused on improving the sharing of data produced by the multidisciplinary Tephra research community. And the reason I think that we so urgently need these improvements of data sharing is that our research is increasingly driven by the availability and of data and the opportunities of new computing resources, of new computing technologies. So if we don't have data available, we're not going to be able to advance. And this is my little cartoon that I often show, that, you know, a data scientist without data is really lost and can't move forward. The principles of FAIR data really were driven by the notion of open science. Open science has been a movement for a number of years and is really aimed at making the results of research that has been publicly funded more accessible, to make it reusable on the one hand, to inform future science, but also to make it reproducible and allow the validation of research results as an essential function of the responsible conduct of research. So there are many components of open science, and we're all familiar with open access publications and open source software and open data. And when I talk now about FAIR and open and just say data, I always mean to include software and samples and other research data outputs as well. So excuse if I don't mention them, but they are meant to always be included. In order to implement the paradigm of open data, there are many stakeholders actually in that process, but the most important ones that matter to us, I think, are the funders. And they have been setting up data sharing policies to make data more open. They have implemented data management plans so that, as we just heard, the researchers think about the data they produce and how they will ensure access and preservation of these data at the beginning of their projects. And publishers have moved into the world of open and fair data. They require data availability statements, but there have also been a number of new author guidelines about sharing data, submitting data to public repositories in order to broaden access to the data, make them publicly accessible. But we should also clearly distinguish that open data is not the same as fair data. These are two different aspects of making data accessible. And I've listed here a number of questions that kind of show that open data alone is not sufficient. If we want to maximize the impact of research results, then we also need to make data more accessible, findable. We need to provide enough information about data quality in order to be able to reuse the data. We need to think about the long-term access. Are data still accessible in 5 or 10 years? And how can we easily integrate data? And again, what this Tephra community has advanced over the last 8 years is providing really a foundation to maximize the impact of their data. So many of you will have heard about the FAIR principles that are intended to guide research data management. The F, as you see, stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And these are 4 foundational principles that allow stakeholders to discover, integrate, reuse, and appropriately cite data that are being generated in research. And clearly, I mean, this is a quote from the Go Fair website, but it's not only intended by contemporary data-intensive science, it's science in the broadest sense that produces data that need to be made fair. And the intention really is to improve the data infrastructure that supports humans and machines in the discovery and analysis of scientific data, as well as the associated software, algorithms, workflows, and samples, as I always emphasize. They are intended as a guideline for data publishers, for data stewards, for researchers, and other stakeholders. And as really needs to be emphasized, it is applied to both human and machine-driven activities, and was originally actually intended mostly to the machine-driven activities, making data more machine actionable with a view on the future management of these data. So in essence, what these FAIR principles demand is that data should be accessible and understandable to humans and machines. The data should be deposited in certified trusted repositories to ensure their persistent access and preservation. And the data should be made citable and should have clear usage licenses. So I'm going to dive a little deeper into the aspects of the FAIR data principles and the individual requirements. This is actually a slide that was presented by Shelley Stahl just last October at a workshop. But I really like it because it shows, the different responsibilities where repositories play a big role and where the community plays a big role. Findable has aspects of assigning persistent identifiers to the data or to samples, making sure that there is rich metadata available, and that these metadata are registered centrally at a searchable resource and so on. These are all responsibilities of the repository. The repository also needs to ensure that there are protocols in place that make the metadata machine accessible, that there are standard protocols for opening up the metadata, but also clear usage licenses and so on. And when it comes to interoperability and reusability, this is really where the community needs to set standards. And again, coming back to this specific workshop here, this initiative for the Tephra community, this is where input from the community is absolutely essential to define community standards that can be implemented by repositories. So just, I pulled out a couple of the most important aspects in the FAIR data ecosystem. And metadata are clearly one of the most important ones. For making data findable, we need rich metadata that are gathered in catalogs and allow you to find the data, and that requires to ask yourself as a community, what is the information that I want to use to find data that are relevant for me? The metadata need to include the persistent identifier for the data so that they can be located. The metadata needs to be persistent so that even if you have a publication that you read in years to come, you can still access the data and the metadata about this data. Metadata contain a lot of vocabularies, and this is one of the big challenges, and I will come back briefly to that, to use the right vocabularies that allow interoperability, that are used in different communities and allow linking of information of data sets of samples across those communities. These vocabularies need to be fair themselves. They need to be findable and accessible to others, and need to be, again, in protocols that allow machine readability of these vocabularies. They need to contain information, other persistent identifiers, for example, that allows the linking of different entities, such as publications, data sets, samples, instruments, and so on. There needs to be rich metadata for reusability and to describe how the data were generated and manipulated and so on. This is just a summary of that because I assume that these presentations will be shared. I think it's good to fully understand what different types of metadata play a role in implementing FAIR. I would have loved to have the diagram that was shown earlier by Christy about the multidisciplinary reach of Tephra research, because that's one of the challenges for Tephra data, is that there are so many different communities touched with the Tephra data. There are lab analytical data, geochronology, geochemistry, there is field data, stratigraphy, there are aspects of volcanology and many other community aspects where it becomes so difficult to agree on common vocabularies, to agree on terminology that describes geological units, properties, units. So even if you come to agreements within the Tephra community, you still need to align with other communities. And the big challenge for both metadata and vocabularies is to identify who actually decides what is the standard, what is the best practice. Tephra is part of YAFTSI, the communities, and there are opportunities for these type of societies to take a more active role in the data world, to take on governance of these aspects of data management. I mentioned already persistent identifiers that play a role in multiple aspects of FAIR. So we have, for example, DOIs that need to be assigned to the data, but increasingly they also assign to software instruments or field programs. And we have IGSNs as a persistent identifier for samples, but also for sampling features such as stations, sections, drill holes, and so on. And these persistent identifiers are so important because they allow to unambiguously locate a resource, be it a sample, be it a data set, to make these resources citable, to link to landing pages where information about the identified resource is persistently available, and to ensure the registration of metadata about the resource in a central registry, such as provided by DataCite or by the IGSN organization, which actually is currently also moving to DataCite. And again, community standards are at the foundation. They are the standards and leading practices that are specific to data and sample types and defined by a given research communities. And they include these different aspects of metadata, vocabularies, and so on. But again, don't forget, they need to be aligned and compatible with broader metadata standards so that the data from a given community can be linked into the broader research data ecosystem. And I've already mentioned the challenges. Oops, that was going backwards. At the foundation, again, of FAIR principles are also the trusted repositories, as was mentioned earlier already. They ensure the contribution of metadata to centralized data repositories. They ensure persistence of metadata, the assignment of persistent identifiers, the machine accessibility of the data and metadata. They make sure that there is essential protocol for safety and security followed, authentication for accessing data where that is necessary, that usage licenses are assigned, and that community standards are followed. And so there are actually also principles for data repositories that ensure that their operations follow international standards, that these trusted digital repositories have sustainable governance and an organizational framework with reliable infrastructure and comprehensive policies that support community agreed practices. There is a set of principles parallel to the FAIR principles that specifically applies to the operation of repositories, and they're called the trust principles. And you can read more detail actually in this publication by Lin et al. Again, we've talked about that, so in the benefit of time, I'm going to jump over that. I just wanted to mention a few organizations that really are essential in the implementation of FAIR principles. There has been for now 8 years a collaboration between data repositories and publishers, the Coalition for Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences, or COPTIS, that has coordinated activities in the world of publishing with the world of data repositories, making sure that workflows, procedures, policies are aligned between these two important stakeholders. And a lot of that was achieved through the Enabling Fair Data project that was executed by the AGU. Funders now increasingly support the advancement of implementation of FAIR principles. And I know Raleigh Martin is going to talk in this panel as well. So we're probably going to hear more about the ongoing solicitation right now about research coordination networks that advance the implementation of fair and open science principles. NASA has similar policies emerging and implemented that advance open and fair data management. But there is a whole world of initiatives out there to advance fair, and you can really crawl the internet. It's way beyond this presentation to talk about all these different initiatives that hopefully will help implement new solutions for governance of community-based standards that help to coordinate between different communities to ensure the alignment of standards and so on. So I end with a few nuggets as food for thought in further discussions that may happen within this workshop, really to think about, what are our requirements for interoperability and reusability, best practices for researchers to report their data. Obviously, we've already seen templates that support that, but there is also a need to think about the more technical aspects of data structures, vocabularies, and protocols for data exchange that will advance global integration and exchange of data, because we know we have a distributed world of data. We need to think about the adoption of these standards. What are the necessary culture changes, and what incentives or carrots and sticks do we need to bring the culture change into reality? What other things, just standards, best practices, do we need to be aware of that we need to align with and coordinate with? So this is just an overview, and thank you so much again for the opportunity to talk about the FAIR principles, trust principles, and the research data management ecosystem here at this workshop. And I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back to the next. I think Guy is next.